Welcome to Decision Makers, our frequent conversations with policymakers, prognosticators, and experts offering us the latest insights and perspectives on a wide range of issues. I'm Charles Ellison, your executive producer and host. This session, we have a conversation with Maryland State Delegate Regina Boyce, who oversees the state's 43A legislative district. She joins us as part of our continuing Decision Makers State Legislator Communities of Color series, which we do often in partnership with the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. Thank you for being here, Delegate.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I appreciate it. So there's a lot of uncertainty, of course, with the new administration coming into Washington, and wondering what the conversation is like amongst your constituents there in Baltimore in 43-8, what they're saying as they're thinking those issues, and how do you think you'll tackle them? What are the issues that are top of mind for them the most as they're thinking of a new Trump administration coming into Washington?
I think the conversation really is about how are we looking to be stable and how are we looking to protect what we already have. And so as a state in general, we are facing a massive budget deficit, which is top priority. And so how do we fund our priorities? How do we keep those priorities that we have? And how do we now move forward these next 4 years in maintaining our current priorities without the support of, of the federal government? And so I know the governor has done some, has a consultant right now to find out what that looks like. I know he's looking at figuring out what we can cut. And of course, we know we can't cut our way out of our budget. But again, how do we certainly cut programs and services that aren't working and potentially reimagine them or get rid of them altogether, fortunately or unfortunately? And most importantly, how do we keep what we have? We passed a very robust Climate Solutions Now legislation back in 2022. And so really the future has been not so much the implementation, but funding it. And so there'll be many people bringing many different bills about how to fund this initiative so that we can make progress. We had a 5 million trees initiative passed in 2021, I believe, that has been starting to be implemented. And that was 500,000 of those trees to be planted in Baltimore City. And so how are we protecting that initiative and those funds going forward? Because I think, especially from the city level, we can show that we've been making progress and planting tons of trees and mature trees at that. And so we had a robust education program that we passed in 2019 called the Blueprint for Maryland's Future that is fully funded until 2027, but need to figure out how to get it funded after that. So this is the funding game. How do we keep our current priorities? How do we keep our current healthcare? How do we keep our current protections, whether it's protection against vulnerable communities or protections against women's ability to make decisions about their own bodies, their own healthcare? And so I think that is the major priority, I think, this coming legislative session. And I think a lot of people know that we still have a housing crisis that we have to still manage. People still need housing. How are we going to make sure we house people? What is the stock that we already have here in the state of Maryland with whether it's state-owned buildings that are vacant or very large complex buildings that are vacant or just vacant housing in general? Last year, this past session, I passed a bill that would allow Baltimore City, but it was spread through the rest of the state, to tax vacant and blighted property at a higher rate so that those properties can move. There's so many people sitting on property, and also bringing down the value of homes in areas where the value can be pretty stable, but for these vacant properties that are sitting. And so hoping that will move folks to do something with that property, sell it, demo it in the cases where it needs to be demoed, but most importantly, put it back into use, because we do have a housing crisis and a housing affordability issue, and we can get a lot of folks housed without potentially having to even build brand new housing. So I think that's the state of what we're looking at right now.
Yeah. You were talking a few moments ago about expecting a lack of support, in the next administration, expecting a lack of support from Washington, not as much support as you were getting before. So do you envision a situation where the governor, the legislature responds in a way similar to how California is responding right now, some sort of emergency session, to also think about, well, how do we as a state of Maryland protect ourselves against potential encroachments from the federal government?
Well, we're not. So as I mentioned, the governor has sought a consultant right now to work through
Okay.
that. The We haven't seen the budget from the governor just quite yet.
Okay.
But once we do, we can start then making decisions. I would say a special session has not been called. I don't know if that's going to be something that would be after our legislative session and not before. Our session starts Wednesday, January the 8th. And so it may be premature to have a special session when we
Okay.
don't know all that it's at risk. I mean, what's at risk is all the funding or matching funding we've been able to get. For instance, we had a major transportation initiative called the Red Line that the past governor, a Republican governor, essentially canceled and literally sent back millions of dollars to the federal government for a project that would really help boost transportation in Baltimore City. Under Governor Moore, 2022, we kind of rebooted that to a 2.0, and it was certainly had funding to start working through those implementations, but certainly funding, are we going to be able to get that type of funding now? And so it's hard to even say that this project may be on hold for right now, because we're not going to be able to get the funding for it. But how do we, for instance, keep that still alive and relevant so that when we do have a go, when we do can kind of create some partnerships, whether it's somehow finagling it through this administration, coming administration, or hopefully the next administration will be ready to hit the ground running, rather than having to kind of pick back up, do studies again, and do the work again to implement this Red Line project. And so that's pretty much not jumping the gun, but again, how do we just protect ourselves? What legislation do we need? What funding do we need to do that? What do we potentially know that we're going to lose? As you know, the Key Bridge was hit back in April, and the federal government promised to fully fund that rebuild, which is anticipated to be fully rebuilt by 2028. And so them leaving session, the Congress leaving session, will we have that money so that we can rebuild? And thinking about the impact, the environmental impact it has, we've got more cars on the road for longer times without that bridge. And then, in general, with such an environmental issue with between the bridge and the concrete and the materials falling into our waters, we need this more than anybody else, and that is kind of one of the biggest priorities right now. And then the lawsuits between environmental remediation to liability of the Dolly to you name it, everything's out there. So that's, I think, the priority. And again, also moving forward is what we're trying to do, is just work to stabilize what we can do, what we can't do, and how we'll have to kind of reconfigure.
This is more of a civic literacy question, and I wonder about how you help your constituents understand the extent of what's happening in Annapolis and the state's capital. How do you help them? How do you guide them and navigate them through activities going?
Sure, Sure. I think I'm breaking up or you're breaking up. It might be me.
That's okay. I can hear you good. Can you hear me?
Okay, it's me. Okay, it's okay. I'm good. Yeah. So I think the way I do it is that we stay in constant contact as much as we can. I have a newsletter that goes out both on my delegate side as well as my campaign side to say, hey, this is what's going on. Here's what I'm doing. Here's what's happening. Here are the big things that we're talking about. And we also help get those messages and talking points from our leadership. And for us, that's the Speaker of the House and her leadership, so that we're all kind of saying the same thing in that, here's the budget issue, or here's the big bills, or here's the big things that we'll be talking about during session. And so I do that through a newsletter. on both fronts. Social media is huge. You know, I didn't think I would have to be so engaged in social media. If I weren't in this position, I would not be on social media as much as I feel like I have to be, because if it's not on social media, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen, right? And so that is the way we keep in touch. First, is because session is pretty much every day for us for 90 days. I don't get to go to many community meetings as possible. And so we also have a pre-session town hall, and then we'll also have a post-session town hall to say like what we think was going to happen, what we wanted to do, and then post-session to say this is actually what happened and this is actually what we did, and then putting that message out again through social media and through our newsletter network. So, and then usually doing a round robin of touching different community associations afterwards to say, you know, individually kind of repeat what happened. And then to a degree, the doors open during session, you know, if it's questions specifically about session. Of course, there's always constituent services, so we're always touching our constituents through constituent services, even through the 90-day sessions, because issues are issues. They don't stop because it's session.
You know, another thing too, a big issue, and you already sort of touched on it, you hinted at it earlier on in our discussion here on Decision Makers. You're a big champion, big advocate for environmental issues and climate pollution, especially air pollution in particular, heat waves, heat inequity, big issues for you, particularly in your district and in a city like Baltimore. And so, especially when we look at heat equity, especially lethal urban heat island impacts, are of major concern to residents in a city like Baltimore. And so how are you addressing that? What's the conversation like around heat inequity and heat waves and lots of people getting hurt from, you know, a combination of the heat of urban heat island impacts and air pollution?
Yeah, so you know, again, one of those initiatives was in 2021 when we did the 5 million trees initiative across the state, targeting 500,000 trees in Baltimore City. And so those plantings have begun in places where there is more quote unquote concrete and sidewalk and streets than there are dense houses and trees. And so that process has started. Communities have been applying, churches have been applying. To get those trees in the ground. We have two also tree organizations within Baltimore City. One is connected to the city called, oh God, I always get these mixed up, Tree Baltimore. And then the other one is the Tree Trust, which is a nonprofit who's been tasked to usually are contracted to plant all these trees within the city, planting them, of course, where people want them, because trees also have a negative connotation to a degree in some parts of the city, but getting people to understand the reason for them, values of property, again, reducing that heat island effect, providing some shade in places where, you know, part of Baltimore City, it's very interesting because you can get some places that look very suburban, and some places that kind of, you know, depending on where you are, you might think you're in a rural area. And then you have, of course, the densely packed spaces where it's nothing but row home upon row home upon row home and not very much trees. And those are the kind of the places that we're looking to attack. There's also been legislation in the past. It's not been successful, but really looking at ensuring, for instance, that apartment buildings, but not so much new ones, because new apartment buildings tend to have appropriate heating and AC, HVAC, but ensuring older buildings start essentially providing AC and not necessarily making it a choice, because it does become hotter and you have more incidents, especially with seniors who tend to be in the house all day that don't have AC. I'm somebody who doesn't really have AC as well, but I don't spend so much time at home during the summer. I have window units where they're needed. But these type of kind of past legislations look at, for instance, making sure those, especially those old apartment buildings, are providing air-conditioned units for those older apartment buildings. And so it's like those little things like that in areas where there's lots of parking lots, um, in urban areas where like row homes have been torn down, it was turned into a parking lot. Is there plans? Is it underutilized? And if it's underutilized, how much of that can we take up and plant for green space or new housing or plant trees? And so there's all those little things that are, I think, happening to address those type of issues, very specific issues.
Do you think, Delegate, that there is this path? I know you talked about that budget deficit earlier in Maryland, but do you think that there's a path toward another comprehensive climate bill or a comprehensive bill for climate resilient infrastructure interventions in Maryland? I mean, but doing that in a way that doesn't add any more major costs to like a state
Yeah,
mention that's tight.
I hear you. I hear you. I think the biggest issue we have right now is that we need to implement what we already have. We can't really begin to do more in certain areas if we don't know of the policies that we've already passed, that we actually haven't implemented to see if they actually work, to be able to adjust and then move forward. And so I think the biggest focus has been to how to fund what we've already essentially put into policy. And it's very, very high maintenance, very robust, of its kind across the country. And so how are we implementing that, learning those lessons, and then building from there? Climate resiliency always comes up, especially with flood mitigation, especially the way flooding works and flooding insurance. Those things come up often. Climate resiliency now building into construction and planning to ensure that there are those resiliencies. We talk about locations that are in 100-year flood areas. It's like, so if it's in a 100-year flood zone, why do we allow it to be built there to begin with? And so those are things that are happening, for instance, in Baltimore County, Howard County, where there was a historic city. It's pretty much downhill, and every so often when we have this major rainfalls, it floods so much that it was 2 devastating floods in a course of 2 to 3 years, which included death, a lot of destruction. But what it showed is that, look, the more we build uphill without water being able to kind of have uplands to like take it in, it has to go somewhere. So it goes downhill. And so looking at the type of development and zoning laws that really look at upland development, how it affects downland. And so one of the things they've done, some properties at this point just had to be taken down in a way so that when there is flooding, you've got a space and a gap that can take in the rest of that water, versus then going through that destruction and then going through having to get insurance again, only for it to happen again. So really looking at, when we talk about climate adaptation and resiliency, we're looking at how zoning laws are changed, how construction laws and regulations are changed, so that we're building different and not building the same, knowing that the results down the line are going to be detrimental, because we're going to be facing more flooding, dry land, so on and so forth. So it's always in the works, but we're trying to really implement what we already have.
Got it. We've been talking with Delegate Regina Boyce. Thank you again, Delegate, for your time. So for more on Delegate Boyce, you can go to reginatboyce.com. That concludes this episode. I'm Charles Ellison, your executive producer. Raven Robinson is senior producer. A warm hand of gratitude to our partner at the Council of State Governments East. For more information on them, go to csg-erc.org. Until then, find this episode and more content, while, of course, you're subscribing at thebnote.com. Take care and be safe.